April of 1857, a cotton broker from Charleston stumbled on something that would haunt him until his death 3 decades later. While reviewing plantation ledgers at a modest estate called Moss Creek in Middle Georgia, he noticed a disturbing pattern. Over a span of 15 years, 23 young men had been sold each for prices far above the market rate. Next to every transaction was the same cold note in the margin prime condition certified. At the time, the broker couldn't have guessed what those 2 words really meant. Only years later would it be revealed that this phrase masked a secret so dark it threatened to unravel the carefully maintained lies of Georgia's most powerful families. For years, authorities burned records, intimidated witnesses, and buried the truth. But not all secrets stay hidden, especially when someone takes the time to write them down in detail. One woman did just that, understanding that truth itself could become the most dangerous weapon. That woman was Eleanor Creswell. And the plantation she inherited would eventually be remembered not as farmland, but as a graveyard for both bodies and reputations. Moss Creek Plantation, spread across 370 acres of red Georgia clay along the Oconee River, was nothing like the grand estates of Southern aristocracy. There were no white columns, no sweeping gardens, no glittering parties. Instead, it was known for efficiency. The 2-story timber house was plain and practical, surrounded by 12 slave cabins, a cotton gin, a smokehouse, and a barn, larger than seemed necessary for a property its size. Eleanor had taken control of Moss Creek in 1840 after her husband Thomas died suddenly of what doctors called apoplexy. She was only 31, childless, and expected by neighbors to return to Savannah, where her family owned a respectable shipping business. Instead, she fired the overseer and managed the plantation herself. Within a year, she turned it from a struggling operation into one of the county's most profitable. Her method was simple but chilling. While other planters held enslaved families for generations, she treated people as short-term investments. She bought young men at market, kept them for a year or so, then sold them westward to planters in Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, where demand was endless. Her workforce of women never exceeded half a dozen, all chosen for their age and inability to bear children. To Eleanor, families were inefficiencies. She wanted controlled profit, and something else her neighbors would only begin to understand far too late. By 1845, she had earned a reputation as a sharp businesswoman. Men who once refused to deal with her grudgingly admitted her knowledge of soil cotton yields and market timing was unmatched. She never attended church or social gatherings, and when asked about her unusual behavior, she gave only a thin smile that never reached her eyes. Widowhood, she said, had freed her from the burden of pretense. No one at the time could have guessed that Eleanor kept not 1, but 3 different sets of records. The first was ordinary plantation paperwork, the kind any tax assessor or nosy neighbor might glance at: expenses, cotton yields, slave sales. The second, tucked away but still legible, contained the true profits of Moss Creek, which were far higher than what she admitted publicly. But the third ledger was the one that mattered, hidden inside an iron box beneath the floorboards of her bedroom. Written in a cipher she had devised years earlier from shipping manifests she had studied in her father's Savannah business. In those coded pages, she wrote down everything: names, dates, ages, descriptions, so detailed they read less like property inventories and more like the notes of a scientist cataloging specimens. Eye color, hair texture, the set of a jaw, the way skin looked under lamplight. Piece by piece, she was building a secret record, one that would matter only when the time came to expose what she had truly been doing. At Moss Creek, the pattern never changed. Every new purchase was a young man, never older than 25, never younger than 18, healthy, strong, and separate from the others for his first week. The enslaved community knew what this meant. though they never dared speak of it, not even in whispers. On the seventh night, Eleanor summoned him to the main house. What happened behind closed doors was never spoken of, but those who worked nearby noticed the same chilling details. Eleanor always bathed beforehand, always wore the same plain gray dress, always kept a lamp burning past midnight. The next morning, the young men returned, changed quiet, hunched, avoiding eye contact. And the day after, Eleanor would sit in her study for hours, the iron box open beside her, writing in her coded book with the intensity of someone testifying before a judge. The first disappearance came in the autumn of 1843. A man named Samuel sold to a planter in Alabama for the extraordinary sum of $1,800, never arrived at his new home. The buyer demanded answers. Eleanor coolly sent back a signed bill of sale receipts from the transport driver and a note expressing polite concern. Slaves, she reminded him, often ran. The matter ended there. 6 months later, another man, Isaac, vanished en route to Mississippi. Again, she produced flawless paperwork, and again, the explanation of escape satisfied the buyer. By 1847, 5 men had disappeared without reaching their destinations. The odds should have seemed impossible, but Eleanor's reputation shielded her. To the buyers, her suggestion that these men had bolted for freedom made sense. In a system built on fear of escape, the lie was too convenient to question. What no one realized was that none of those men had left Georgia. Their bodies were buried in rocky ground on Moss Creek land, a patch Eleanor had declared off-limits, claiming she would plant an orchard there someday. The orchard never came. Instead, that soil became her cemetery. Her ritual was as methodical as everything else she did. After the first week, she treated each man well. She made sure he ate, worked, grew stronger. She even had doctors certify them as prime condition, increasing their value at market. She arranged the sales far away. Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, always through middlemen who handled the transport. Then, 3 nights before departure, she called him to the barn after dark. The barn was enormous for a plantation its size, and in its back was a locked room few had ever seen. There she offered whiskey laced with laudanum, just enough to slow the body without silencing the mind. She wanted them awake. She wanted them to understand. With calm precision, she opened her ledger, showing them the coded entries explaining exactly what she had written about them. Every detail, every observation. And in that moment, the young men realized they were not just property in her eyes, but specimens in an experiment, pieces in a ledger that was as much about control as it was about profit. She told him about the small details she had written down, the eyes, the jaw, the scar on a palm. And then she explained what those details meant. Not that he was valuable for labor, but that his face and features were proof she could use to expose and ruin the families who had built their lives on lies. He watched her until understanding spread across his face, and when the laudanum eased him into a drowsy stupor, she called the only person who knew the whole plan, the only person she trusted to finish the work with her. That man was Henry Creswell, a son no public record acknowledged. Officially, Eleanor and Thomas had been childless, but in 1829, when she was 20 and unmarried, Eleanor bore a son in secret. The scandal would have ruined her family, so the baby was sent north to be raised by an aunt in Philadelphia and given a new name. Henry grew up knowing who his mother was and knowing the truth about his father, a black dock worker in Savannah who had been sold away when Eleanor's pregnancy could no longer be hidden, and who later died on a sugar plantation in Louisiana. The memory of that man, worked to death and buried without a marker, turned Eleanor's grief into something cold and relentless. Henry returned to Georgia in 1841, posing as a traveling merchant from Philadelphia. He stayed in boarding houses, made rounds in Milledgeville and Augusta, and visited Moss Creek under the cover of business. No one noticed that he sometimes slept in the main house, or that he and Eleanor spent long nights with the coded ledger open between them, planning which names to expose next. The barn held more than hay. A trap door led to a hidden cellar where tools and implements were kept, and certain tasks were done in total privacy. Eleanor did not pick victims at random. She studied markets in Savannah, Augusta, and Milledgeville with the care of a breeder reading bloodlines. But she was studying faces. Years of gathering family histories, gossip, and genealogy let her match features to family trees, and to secrets she intended to use as evidence. She knew which planters had fathered children with enslaved women, which families carried hidden mixed-race branches, which men kept quiet households with slave mistresses on the edge of their property lines. She knew because wealthy men rarely bothered to hide their sins, because enslaved servants carried stories from one kitchen to another, because whispers moved through networks of people that white society never imagined existed. When Eleanor saw a young man whose face carried the mark of a powerful bloodline, a Caldwell's strange gray-green eyes, a Rutledge's hawk nose, a Peyton's square jaw, she bought him no matter the cost. She brought him to Moss Creek, carried out her ritual, and recorded his features in her cipher, with the precision of a scientist cataloging evidence. She wasn't gathering this proof for the courts. She knew Southern law would never side with her against the men she despised. Her weapon was not legal judgment, but shame. She was compiling undeniable evidence to strip the mask from the South's most respected families, to force them to face the truths they had buried under generations of lies. These men became her proof first living, and then because living testimony could be silenced, twisted, or lost dead proof. Bones could not lie, and bones could not run. By 1850, 13 men were buried in the stony section of Moss Creek that she had claimed was reserved for an orchard. 13 bodies, 13 coded entries, 13 family names waiting for ruin. But the world around her was shifting. The uneasy balance of the Compromise of 1850 had stalled conflict for a time, but tension thickened in every debate over slavery's expansion. Eleanor began to wonder if the war that seemed inevitable would swallow her plans before she ever revealed them. Then, in the summer of 1856, a letter arrived from Boston. It came from Daniel Harrington, a lawyer and correspondent for the abolitionist paper, The Liberator. He claimed to have heard troubling things about her plantation, about the rapid turnover of men, about disappearances after sales. He intended to visit Georgia in September and hoped to speak with her. Eleanor read the letter slowly, 3 times over her hands, calm, her expression unchanged. When Henry arrived that evening, she passed it to him without a word. He studied it and asked if they should lie low until the man lost interest. Eleanor gave him that familiar thin smile, the one that never reached her eyes. "No," she said. "We invite him. We show him exactly what he expects to see: a thriving plantation managed by a capable widow. Then we learn who sent him and how much he really knows." What she didn't yet realize was that this letter wasn't just a threat. It was the opening note of something larger, a convergence of forces that would drag every one of her secrets into the open far sooner than she had ever planned. Daniel Harrington's first days in Georgia left him with more questions than answers. Eleanor Cresswell had been everything he expected her to be: polished, composed, prepared with explanations that on the surface rang true. Everyone he interviewed in Milledgeville backed her reputation. Merchants vouched for her reliability. Planters respected her efficiency, and the local doctors swore to the authenticity of the medical certificates he had signed. It was all too clean, too consistent, and Harrington's instincts told him that consistency itself was the warning sign. On the 4th night, when he was preparing to return to his notes in defeat, a quiet knock came at his boarding house door. An elderly black woman stood in the shadows of the hallway. Her hands folded, her eyes wary. She introduced herself as Ruth, a house servant at Moss Creek, and asked if she could speak to him privately. Harrington let her in, closing the door behind them, and watched as she stood near the fire, her voice low and careful. She told him she had lived at Moss Creek since the days of Thomas Cresswell had been kept on when Eleanor took over, and had seen things she could no longer keep buried. She spoke of the young men Eleanor brought to the plantation, how they were kept apart that first week, how Eleanor bathed and dressed in gray before summoning them to the main house. She described the way those men emerged, changed shoulders, bent eyes hollow, never the same again. She whispered of the barn, of the locked room at the back of nights, when lamps burned late and muffled sounds carried across the yard. Ruth's hands trembled as she spoke, but her voice hardened when she described the section of land Eleanor claimed she would someday turn into an orchard. No one was ever allowed to work it. She said she had seen Henry the merchant from Philadelphia, who visited, often slip into the barn after dark, and she knew he was not simply a business associate. "He's her blood," she said quietly, "and he helps her with the burying." Harrington took careful notes as Ruth spoke, his legal mind racing. This was the first true breach in Eleanor's armor, but it was also dangerous. He knew enough about Georgia to understand that if Ruth were discovered, her life would not be worth an hour's promise. When she finished, she pressed his notebook closed with her palm and fixed him with a steady gaze. "You came down here looking for proof. I've given you what I can, but if you mean to use it, you need to be quicker than her. She knows things before others do. She'll know about me soon enough." That night, Harrington lay awake in the boarding house, turning Ruth's words over in his mind. For the first time, he understood that he was not simply investigating irregularities in slave sales. He was circling something larger, something colder, something that went beyond profit or cruelty. Eleanor Cresswell was building a record, a ledger of blood and lineage. And if Ruth was right, the bodies were still close, hidden in the Georgia soil beneath that barren stretch of land. The lawyer from Boston had come south looking for evidence. What he had found was a secret too dangerous to keep, and far too explosive to reveal, without proof that could not be denied. And in September of 1856, proof was the one thing Eleanor Cresswell controlled better than anyone else. Harrington slowed his steps as they passed the edge of the property, his eyes fixed on the ground Ruth had described. To anyone else, it might have looked like nothing. Just a stretch of red Georgia clay, too rocky for crops, dotted with patches of stubborn weeds. But Harrington noticed the uneven lay of the soil, the way tufts of grass grew in irregular patterns, greener in some spots, thinner in others, as if the earth itself had been disturbed and never fully settled. He said nothing, but he filed it away, his instincts sharpening. Back at the house, Eleanor poured him another glass of water, as if she had all the time in the world. "You see, Mr. Harrington," she said, with that familiar thin smile, "Moss Creek is no different from any other plantation in Georgia. Hardly worth your time." Harrington nodded politely, but inside he was seething. He had Ruth's testimony, he had his suspicions, but what he lacked was proof, the kind of proof that could survive scrutiny, that could not be brushed aside as abolitionist propaganda. Without it, Eleanor Cresswell remained untouchable. That evening, back in his boarding house, Harrington wrote furiously in his notebook. He sketched the layout of Moss Creek from memory, marked the location of the barn, the cabins, the suspicious plot of land Eleanor called her future orchard. He recorded Ruth's words as precisely as he could recall them, knowing that even whispers might someday matter. He considered returning to Boston, publishing what he had gathered, but he knew how it would look. Stories of odd behavior, suspicious disappearances, and uneven soil. These were rumors, not evidence. And rumors would not bring down someone as careful as Eleanor Cresswell. On his second night in Milledgeville, Harrington awoke to the sound of footsteps outside his room. When he opened the door, the hallway was empty, but a folded note had been slipped beneath the threshold. No signature, no greeting, just a single line written in a neat hand. If you want the truth, watch the barn after midnight. Harrington sat on the edge of his bed, the paper trembling slightly in his fingers. It could be a trap. It could be Eleanor herself baiting him into overstepping so she could discredit him. Or it could be the opportunity he had been waiting for a chance to see for himself what Moss Creek truly hid beneath its calm surface. The lawyer from Boston had come south seeking evidence. Now, for the first time, the evidence might be within reach if he was willing to risk his life to find it. Eleanor set the iron box on Ruth's lap and lifted the lid, and under the lamplight, the coded pages looked like a map of other people's lives, names and dates, and tiny drawings of eyes and noses. And she pointed to a sketch and spoke slowly, so Ruth could follow Isaac, she said. His eyes that gray-green, the same shade in the Caldwell portrait. The same shade that runs in that family for 3 generations. And Ruth's mouth opened, but no sound came. Eleanor kept going. I found patterns in portraits, in court records, in gossip, buried in trunks and letters. I tracked who married, who, and who disappeared, and who sent boys downriver, and then pretended they ran away. This is not random, she said. This is design. Every man I chose ties back to a home or a name that will refuse to look at what they made. And if the law will not touch them, then shame will shame, that will eat them from the inside out. Ruth looked as if she might rise and flee, but Eleanor simply folded another page toward her and showed measurements of jaw and ear and a list of places where the men were sent. I do not kill for sport, she said. I make proof, I make evidence, but proof left where it is will do nothing. It must be undeniable. It must be pinned to the bodies and the bones and the ledger. And now, Harrington has sniffed around. The risk has grown. We cannot wait. Henry will come in the night, and we will move faster. We will finish cataloging, and then we will decide who must fall first. Ruth trembled and asked what she would be asked to do, and Eleanor looked at her with a calm that chilled Ruth more than any shout could have. You stayed, she said. You kept what you saw, and for that there will be mercy. If you stay silent and help, there will be death if you do not. And Ruth understood then that she had stepped into something far larger than fear or pity. Something measured and brutal, and that Moss Creek would never again be ordinary. Until Eleanor chose to burn its name down, or until someone else found the same ledger and read it aloud. Eleanor's voice dropped to a whisper as she leaned toward Ruth, her words like ice cutting through the warm air of the parlor. There are 12 more, she said, tapping the lid of the iron box with her fingers. 12 more who carry the blood of families that claim to be pure, who build their entire existence on the lie of racial superiority. Ruth's eyes widened her weathered face, a portrait of horror and comprehension. And you killed them, she said. I preserved the evidence, Eleanor corrected, her tone sharp, cold. Living men can vanish. They can be sold again, hidden, or disappear into the endless expanse of this country. Dead men stay where I put them. Dead men can be exhumed. Their bones can be measured, examined, compared. Dead men cannot deny what their bodies prove. That's murder, Ruth whispered. That's evil. What's evil? Eleanor shot back, her voice low, but shaking with intensity, is the system that created the need for men like Isaac to exist. What's evil is a society that allows wealthy men to rape women they own to father children. They will never acknowledge to build empires on the bodies of people they've declared less than human. I'm not the monster here, Ruth. I'm the reckoning. Ruth sat frozen, her heart pounding as she tried to comprehend the scale of what she was hearing. Finally, she asked the question that had haunted her since Mr. Lell had first appeared at Moss Creek. What about Mr. Lell? She said softly. Who is he really? Eleanor smiled, then a faint flicker of something human passing across her face. "He's my son," she said. "Mine and the child of a man my father once owned. That's why I understand this fight, Ruth. That's why I'll never stop. Because my own child exists in a world that would destroy him if they knew the truth about his father. A world that needs to burn." Ruth felt the floor tilt beneath her. This wasn't madness. It was something colder, more deliberate, a campaign built over decades, a machine of vengeance already fed with 13 lives. "What are you going to do with all this?" she asked quietly. "When the time comes," Eleanor said, her eyes glittering. "The country is sliding toward war. Everyone feels it. And when that war comes, when the South is weakened and vulnerable, I'll release everything. Every name, every connection, every piece of evidence. I'll mail copies to newspapers in the North and South, to government officials, to churches. I'll make sure the entire nation knows what hypocrites built this system, what lies sustain it. And I'll do it in a way that can't be ignored or suppressed. Because the evidence will be irrefutable." She closed the iron box with a heavy snap and locked it again. "But I need your silence, Ruth. If you talk again, if you bring anyone else here, you won't just be endangering me. You'll be destroying the only chance we have to make these people pay for what they've done. Do you understand?" Ruth nodded, though her stomach churned. Understanding didn't make it right. 13 men were dead. Regardless of whose blood they carried, they had been murdered to serve Eleanor's vision of justice. There had to be another way, Ruth thought. There had to be a path that didn't require killing. But in 1856 Georgia, she knew the truth. No court would accept the testimony of an enslaved woman against a white family. No newspaper would publish accusations from her. No legal mechanism existed to make Eleanor's evidence matter. Eleanor had decided that only injustice could topple injustice. Ruth left the main house that night, carrying a weight she had never asked for, the knowledge of what Moss Creek truly was, and the terrible realization that she was now complicit in whatever came next. And Eleanor moved faster. Between October 1856 and March 1857, she purchased 3 more young men, each chosen with even greater care than before. The slow, deliberate archive she had been building for 16 years became a race against time. Henry appeared more often, sometimes staying for weeks. Moss Creek, already a tomb for bodies and reputations, was now a workshop in its final phase of construction, a place where vengeance and evidence blurred until the line between justice and monstrosity almost disappeared. Thorne did what brokers do. He followed the paper trail. He wrote polite notes to the buyers, listed in Eleanor's ledgers, sending riders and making calls through contacts in Milledgeville and Augusta, asking only whether certain men had arrived and whether the transactions had gone as recorded. The answers were not uniform. A few buyers confirmed receipt and praised the quality of the stock. A couple wrote back confused, saying they had no record of the names Thorne mentioned. One reply came from a planter in Alabama, with anger folded into every line. He had been paid, he said, and a driver had signed for the man. But the slave never arrived. Either the driver had lied or the man had run. Thorne's notes filled with question marks. He expected paperwork errors, not ghosts. The pattern made the hair at the back of his neck stand up. He returned to Moss Creek not as a casual visitor, but as a man with a job to finish. He arrived with a neighbor broker who owed him a favor, and with a constable from the county courthouse, the sort of slow lawman who could at least ask the right questions and put pressure where it hurt. They found Eleanor in the yard, as if nothing had changed. She welcomed them with the same precise politeness, showed them the fields and the cabins, and when they asked to see her sales receipts, she produced tidy stacks of papers, bills of sale signatures, receipts from drivers. Everything that was supposed to convince a buyer looked perfect on the surface. Thorne watched her closely and saw the same flicker of fear he had caught before. But Eleanor answered every question with facts and names and dates. And the constable who dealt with real crimes every week had nothing to seize on beyond suspicion. While the men inspected the house, Thorne's neighbor wandered toward the barn. He poked through the back room, prodded at barrels, shifted a coil of rope, and found by chance a damp patch at the floorboards near where straw had been stacked. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but enough to make his fingers trace along the seams until he found the outline of a trap door. The air under the boards smelled of earth and old cedar. He closed his mouth and called the others. Eleanor's face did not change at first. Then it drained as if color had been pulled from it. Henry, who had been in the house when the men arrived, appeared at the barn doorway like someone called into daylight. He moved toward the trapdoor with slow, controlled steps, as if hoping to stop what had to be stopped without giving away panic. The constable forced the hatch open. What they found first were tools, ropes, a few crates marked with crude numbers. Then a wooden box whose lid bore a partial name scratched into the wood. Then the stench, faint but unmistakable, of earth that had lain sealed for months. The neighbors exchanged looks that meant trouble. The constable ordered men to fetch shovels and to bring witnesses from town. Eleanor took a step forward, voice steady, apologizing for the mess, explaining the barn cellar was an old storage space she had not used. She offered hospitality brandy, any assistant's hands folded as if in prayer. Henry moved like a surgeon, sliding a thin cloth over the edge of the hatch, keeping eyes down, buying them seconds. Outside, the neighbors began to dig, where the land showed signs of disturbance, where Ruth had described fresh fills. The first spade turned over dark earth and bone. Even those who had spent years confining their disgust to private thoughts could not ignore the sight. The county constable called for calm, warned that nothing should be moved until a coroner could be summoned. That call went to the courthouse and back out to the county, and in hours word rode faster than any legal notice. Panic does strange things. Eleanor did not scream. She sank to a chair and began to speak to the men as if they were customers, asking them to sit to rest, to give statements calmly. Henry moved through the yard like a man removing chess pieces from a board. He ordered servants to gather certain trunks, to move crates into the carriage house, to fetch rope and tarps. He paid the constable with folded bills, whose edges caught the sun, and he promised that any examination would show nothing but disturbed soil and animal bones that rumors had made monsters of ordinary livestock burials. Some planters in the crowd wanted immediate arrests. Others scowled at the idea of a public scandal, thinking of families, reputations, futures. A few influential men, when told what had been unearthed, simply shook their heads and left without comment. In a matter of hours, the county became two things at once: an investigating body and a collection of men making decisions about how far they would let the truth go if it ruined more than one household. Thorne stayed. He would not be bought nor bullied. He took notes, watched. Henry watched Eleanor, watched Ruth, who had been kept away from the crowd at Eleanor's quiet insistence. And he thought about the ledger. He'd seen the pattern he'd noticed. He thought of Harrington, of the old article on page 7. And he realized that a small thread had been pulled taut enough now to show the weave beneath. What happened next happened because people chose self-preservation over law. The coroner did not arrive in time to prevent certain men neighbors with heavy boots and heavier opinions from hauling away trunks and boxes under the ruse of helping to collect evidence. Henry moved with them, and though some items were left behind, other things vanished into carriages and were driven away before anyone outside the circle knew where they had gone. Eleanor claimed she had records stored elsewhere, and with a voice that sounded both weary and defiant, said the best proof of her honesty would be to produce original documents from her bank vault in Savannah and from lawyers in Charleston. She promised cooperation. She also warned that if men continued to leap before any proof was fairly judged, families would be destroyed on rumor alone. That line landed in the crowd like a splinter. Thorne demanded the coroner's formal investigation. The coroner, a county official whose livelihood depended on both truth and the goodwill of the powerful, promised to do what he could. He cataloged what remained at the site, bagged fragments, and wrote a report that was careful with words. The bones were inconclusive at first. Small fragments, a jaw with teeth missing a femur, split in a way that suggested deliberate handling. The ledger pages that could not be found left a void where pattern once was obvious. But the trap door and the cellar could not be explained away as a simple storeroom. Word by nightfall had reached Milledgeville, Augusta, and Savannah not as a quiet rumor, but as a charge something in Moss Creek had been disturbed, and men were talking about missing slaves. Eleanor and Henry moved faster after that. Henry made shows of calm, met privately with men in the crowd, and quietly sent riders to Savannah and to Charleston, with copies of selected pages from the ledger, the ones that proved least and confused most, while making sure other copies were already en route to Pennsylvania. He had learned redundancy too well. What had been a private archive became a scattering of seeds, some sent to banks, some to attorneys, some to friends in the North, who might he calculated be sympathetic when the time came. In the days that followed, the county tried to balance two compulsions, to investigate and to protect the order that kept them in place. Thorne pushed for formal charges. The sheriff convened a grand jury. Neighbors gathered evidence for their own protection. And Eleanor, seated in her parlor, kept the iron box within arm's reach, eyes fixed on the road, as if waiting for something she could not name. The unraveling had begun, but exactly how far it would go depended on more than truth. It depended on who chose to speak next, who chose to hide things deeper, and who, if anyone, was willing to risk everything to read the ledger aloud. They closed the roads, and they closed the mouths of men who might ask too many questions, and for a week, Milledgeville smelled of fear and cigar smoke as search parties chased every rumor, but found nothing that fit the neat picture the county wanted. So they took the easiest answer. A dark-skinned man from a neighboring farm was seized one morning near the river, blood on his hands. From a fight with a boar, and under pressure and threats, he confessed to a robbery and to killing Thorne, his name printed in the paper with the word "alleged" beside it. And no one who mattered asked how a pauper could strike down a well-dressed broker without being seen. Henry Cresswell sat in the parlor as the wagons rolled out with trunks and ledger fragments hidden under bales. His jaw set like a man who had rehearsed this grief 1,000 times, while Eleanor played the part she had shaped for herself for decades. The grieving widow who had nothing left to hide and everything to lose. She attended Thorne's small funeral with a face so composed the town murmured about dignity and strength. And that night she and Henry sent the first packets of copied pages by separate riders, one bound for a law office in Charleston, another stitched into a bundle for the Liberator, a third folded and mailed north to a contact in Philadelphia who had promised discretion. Ruth watched them from the shadows of the kitchen and felt the world tilt. She had helped silence her conscience with Eleanor's quiet assurances. But now, each hoofbeat that carried a packet away sounded like a verdict the man held as Thorne's killer was paraded in chains, and the local courts prepared for the easiest condemnation. Newspapers spun versions that suited their readers, and powerful men whispered about putting everything back where it belonged. Yet not all threads could be tied. Thorne's broker notes had already been copied in a clerk's hand before the attack, and those copies made their way to eyes that would not be satisfied with a single confession, and far away in Boston, a lawyer who had once written about Moss Creek read of the attack and remembered a paragraph tucked away on page 7. It pulled him back like a hook. He bought a ticket and packed a notebook, and as the county slept behind boarded shutters, the greater storm Eleanor had planned began its slow turning. Some men thought they had buried the danger with a rope and a scapegoat. But others, quieter and more stubborn, were only just beginning to ask exactly who had benefited from Thorne's death and whether the orchard ground would continue to hide the truth. The searches went nowhere. Patrols combed every plantation for miles, sure that Thorne's killer had to be a runaway. But no one was missing. No overseer reported a fugitive, no neighboring planter claimed a loss, and after a week of scouring the woods and rivers, the investigation faded. Another violent act in a violent land swallowed into silence. What no one realized was that the murderer hadn't fled at all. He had slipped back to Moss Creek into the cellar under the barn, where he shed the bloody clothes, washed his hands, and returned upstairs as Henry Lell, the respectable merchant from Philadelphia. By the time patrols began their search, Henry was already seated in Eleanor's parlor discussing cotton prices with a neighbor who had come to offer condolences for the widow. The killing of slaves had always been framed in Eleanor's mind as sacrifice for a higher cause. Evidence preserved in death, proof of hypocrisy and corruption carved into bone. But Thorne's death was different. He was no planter hiding illegitimate children, no family patriarch guarding secrets. He was simply a man who noticed too much and asked questions. His murder wasn't part of Eleanor's grand design. It was just blood spilled to protect the secrecy of her archive. Henry felt the weight of it too. In the weeks after Thorne's death, he grew quieter. He still worked beside Eleanor, still copied the ledgers and planned the exposures. But the certainty that had carried them both for 16 years had cracked. He had killed a man who was not part of the system they despised, but only a casualty of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. That was the moment the mission at Moss Creek crossed an irreversible line. No longer justice disguised in cruelty, but cruelty itself. No longer a slow campaign against hypocrisy, but a campaign devouring anyone who threatened it. Eleanor's fight had turned her into the very thing she swore she hated most. Someone willing to kill, not for freedom, but for power. And history, indifferent and merciless, would soon make their choices meaningless. When war came, the South collapsed, and Moss Creek with it. Eleanor's plan to reveal everything never saw the light of day. What survived lay locked in boxes beneath her floorboards, waiting for strangers decades later to unearth them and wonder what exactly had happened on that Georgia plantation, where bodies and secrets shared the same shallow graves. The evidence was undeniable. Eleanor's ledgers, cracked open at last, revealed 17 direct connections between enslaved men and the bloodlines of Georgia's most prominent families. She had written down dates and genealogies, sketched faces with careful detail, noted skin tones under lamplight, measured jaw lines, cataloged eye colors, and marked in her own hand which men had been preserved for evidence. It was her chilling euphemism for murder, the phrase that meant their bodies were hidden in the orchard soil rather than sold downriver. When a graduate student finally broke her cipher in the late 1950s and published his dissertation, the findings made ripples in academic circles, but barely stirred the wider public. By then, most of the families Eleanor had intended to expose were either extinct or irrelevant, their fortunes gone with the collapse of the plantation order. The enslaved men she had killed were reduced to numbers in her book's coded designations without names, without living descendants to demand justice. What might have been explosive in 1857 was little more than a grim curiosity in 1959. What her archive did prove beyond argument was that the South's so-called purity was a lie. The very men who preached racial separation, who defended slavery as ordained and natural, were the same men who crossed those boundaries in the privacy of their households. Fathering children, they disowned and burying secrets that Eleanor had spent her life unearthing. The hypocrisy she sought to expose was real, and her evidence was irrefutable. But when the truth finally came to light, the world had shifted so much that it no longer had the power to wound. And so the debate turned not on whether Eleanor was right, but whether what she did could ever be justified. She had killed at least 16 men, perhaps more. She had plotted for decades, weaving a crusade that demanded blood for truth. Some scholars argued she was a woman trapped in an unforgivable system, that the brutality of slavery left her no tools but violence. Others insisted that murder, no matter the aim, corrupted her cause and transformed her into the very monster she despised. The voices of those who lived through Moss Creek complicated the story further. Some survivors described her as cold, but no crueler than her peers. Others, like Ruth, who lived until 1889, spoke in whispers of the dread that hung over the plantation, the way silence itself seemed like survival. Ruth never revealed what Eleanor had confessed to her that night in 1856. Perhaps she understood that some knowledge was too poisonous to release even in freedom. What unsettles us most is how close Eleanor came to pulling it off. Had the war not broken the South apart, had she lived a few more years, had Thorne not glimpsed the pattern, she might have loosed her archive on the world at a moment when it could have brought the house of cards down. She might have forced Georgia's elite to stare into a mirror they could not shatter. She might have used truth as a weapon sharper than any blade. Instead, history buried her plans along with her victims. Moss Creek became another ruin, her ledgers another curiosity, her cause reduced to an academic debate. 16 years of patient calculation, of cold-blooded sacrifice, ended in silence. What remained was not justice, not exposure, but only another layer of blood in an already blood-soaked age. Eleanor Creswell's reckoning never came, not because she was wrong, but because history moved on without her. The men she killed became evidence no one would ever see in her lifetime. Their bloodlines, their faces, their bones collected to prove a truth that didn't matter until a century too late. The families she wanted to bring down collapsed on their own, undone by war, poverty, and the slow decay of the old order. The system she devoted her life to exposing didn't end because of her secret archive. It ended because armies marched, governments fell, and history shifted without her. Moss Creek itself is gone. The fields are paved over the barn, long since collapsed, the house rotted into the soil. Today, a shopping center stands where the plantation once loomed. The rocky plot where Eleanor buried her evidence is now a parking lot. A small historical marker mentions Moss Creek and the widow who ran it, but says nothing of the graves beneath the asphalt. Shoppers walk past it without a glance, unaware that the forgotten lie beneath their feet. The iron box, the ledgers, the coded sketches, all of it sits now in the Georgia Historical Society archives in Savannah. Translated, digitized, available. Any researcher with the patience can pull up the files, read her careful hand trace the names and features of men turned into proof. But hardly anyone does. Eleanor Creswell's life's work, the monstrous archive she believed would force the world to confront its lies, is just another dusty collection few care to examine. That may be the cruelest irony of all. She built her archive to be impossible to ignore. Instead, it is nearly forgotten, and so we're left with questions Eleanor herself never answered. What is the value of truth when it arrives too late to matter? What do we do with evidence of injustice when the guilty are long dead and the victims unnamed? Can violence ever serve justice, or does it only transform the fighter into the very thing they set out to destroy? Eleanor believed she was a reckoning. History remembers her, if at all, as another shadow in a bloody era. So, what do you think? Was she a woman who fought with the only weapons her world allowed? Or was she a monster cloaked in righteous purpose? Could her murders ever be justified, or does her failure prove that violence in the name of justice always corrupts? Share your thoughts in the comments. If if this story unsettled you as much as it did me. Subscribe for more journeys into the dark corners of American history, where the past refuses to stay buried. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.